This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the fourth Tuesday of every month throughout 2023, Mountain Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West. I'm very excited about this year-long series, and I greatly appreciate the Nature Conservancy's generous support. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in Colorado and around the world, visit www.nature.org/Colorado. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Rob Addington. Rob is the director of the Forest and Fire Program at the Nature Conservancy in Colorado. He and his team are focused on increasing the pace and scale of forest restoration in Colorado to reduce hazardous fuels and promote landscape resilience to natural disturbances such as wildfire, as well as climate change. You don't have to live in the West to know that the region has been battling ongoing drought, historically large and intense wildfires, and various forms of insect-induced forest devastation. Over the past few years here in Colorado, we've experienced some of the most destructive wildfires in recorded history, and the pine beetle infestation continues to be a source of serious and increasing concern. And Colorado is obviously not alone. There are similar stories of struggling forests throughout all of the western states. While the current conditions may be dire, you'll be happy to know that Rob and his team at TNC are working extremely hard to find collaborative, creative, and effective solutions to the challenges facing our forests here in the West. By partnering with government agencies, tribal nations, private landowners, and various nonprofits, TNC has been leading and implementing some of the most innovative forest health work in the country, work that's creating more resilient, healthy landscapes across hundreds of thousands of acres. For all the listeners who've been asking for a wildfire and forest health-focused episode, this one's for you. I met up with Rob at the TNC office in Boulder, and he was kind enough to educate me on both the big picture and finer details of all things forest health. You can check out the notes for a full list of everything we discussed, but a few of the topics include the infamous 2020 wildfire season and the outlook for 2023, the history of land management and how that has affected wildfires, pine beetles, wildfires' effects on water quality, how beavers can play a role in fire mitigation, some specific success stories, business solutions for forest health, the all-important focus on partnerships, post-fire land management strategies, good books, and much more. Be sure to visit the episode webpage for links to everything, including TNC's new Western Division Forest and Fire Initiative. A huge thanks to Rob for taking the time to answer all my questions, and another huge thanks to TNC for leading all of this important work. I hope you enjoy. All right, Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I was telling you before we started recording on the way up here that just selfishly, I have so many questions about fire, and it's something that it's like a blank spot in my brain of issues about the West, and I feel like I don't know as much as I should. And it's such a pressing issue. So I just really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. And I was thinking the way to start, you and I are about the same age. We've been in Colorado about the same amount of time, although you were here for college beforehand. But I'd love to hear what you were thinking in the summer of 2020 when everything was crazy, pandemic was going on. And then to top it all off, we were maybe 5-6 months into the pandemic. And then in your line of work, the craziest stuff ever started happening. Truly, like some of the craziest stuff ever. So could you talk a bit about summer of 2020 and really just, first of all, what happened as far as fires and how out of the ordinary that was? And then what did you think? Because you've been spending, at that point, well over 2 decades, I guess, studying it. And so you're seeing this happen. So take me back to 2020. What were you thinking?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ed, and
Yeah.
just really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be on the podcast,
Sure.
and great to meet you, and thank you for everything you're doing here through Mountain and Prairie. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've long been involved in forest and fire-related work, and specific to the 2020 wildfire season, it, of course, was like no other season that we'd seen here in Colorado in terms of the overall wildfire activity, the scale, intensity, severity of the fires that we were seeing. And so, interestingly, I think about that year in total and how the spring, through spring snowstorms, precipitation, shaped up, where we often look to that spring period and precipitation patterns that happen during that time of the year, and then also the summer monsoon. So as we get the rains, these convective storms often in July, August timeframe, just kind of these dynamics with precipitation patterns that really influence wildfire activity. And so we had a pretty wet spring that year, not too unlike what we're experiencing this year, although not quite as wet as what we've seen this spring. But then the tap just shut off essentially in July, and we just did not see any, to speak of, real moisture through the monsoonal flow pattern that we would typically see. And so just real dry conditions that materialized in July on through August. And because of the somewhat wet spring, a lot of fuel that was out there to burn, that was available to burn in that year. And so as we started seeing more ignitions, more wildfire activity, the Cameron Peak fire in mid-August in particular, and then going into some pretty dry months through the fall on into September and October, knew that it was going to be scary, going to shape up to be a pretty intense season. And then, of course, what we saw itself that year in terms of the three largest wildfires now on record for the state burning in that year. The Cameron Peak fire at over 208,000 acres, now our largest wildfire on record for the state. And then just the way in which the fires sort of all in total between East Troublesome, Calwood, Grizzly Creek, Pine Gulch earlier in the season, just these fires in total affected the landscape and just what we saw as it relates to wildfire activity, extreme fire behavior, air quality impacts, just everything that we're concerned about as it relates to these extreme fire events, all manifesting in that season, and again, just fire behavior like we had never seen before.
Was it the kind of thing when it was happening that you were like, I can't believe this. This is beyond anything I could have imagined, or was it this is what we've been waiting for. This is what's going to happen, or maybe some combination.
Yeah, I would say some combination, but certainly those moments of just disbelief. And I'll say, one of the lowest points in my career, having really spent my career working on these issues, was the day that the East Troublesome made its big run, over 100,000 acres in a single day. 6,000 acres per hour, I think, was the rate of spread for that fire. And just one of those, and across the Continental Divide, as we know, as well, just one of those days where you think, everything that you've worked for and all the energy that you've put into the work that you've been focused on, is it all for naught? And can we really have some influence in the face of these extreme wildfire events through forest management? So, I try to maintain, I consider myself an eternal optimist and try to maintain a glass half full perspective, but you do have those days certainly when you question the impact that you can make, and that was certainly one of those days for me. But on the other side, as we've come out of the wildfires from that season, we've seen a recovery in some parts of the landscape, and then we think about the natural dynamics of fire and the adaptations that a lot of our systems have to fire. In my mind, there's always hope, and that's what we need to be clinging to and thinking about as it relates to recovery and then adaptation going forward for future events like what we saw in 2020.
And going from that summer to this summer, What's the outlook for this summer? And do you even think about it in terms of outlooks for a season? Like, I know it's so green here. I used to live here in Boulder. I've never seen it this green. It's amazing. And I think most of Colorado has experienced, but it could all change pretty quickly, huh?
Absolutely.
If we had another July like 2020.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly the dynamic that is always concerning, where we, of course, love to see the precipitation that we have gotten, the kind of snow that we got through the winter, balanced, against impacts like flooding and things that we experience from the precipitation itself. But as it relates specifically to fire, this dynamic with fuel production through the spring months, and then if we do have a dry latter part of the summer, increased fire risk related to the availability of fuel on the landscape. So that's certainly always in the back of my mind in a season like this. The Division of Fire Prevention and Control does yearly outlook for fire. They do a briefing with the governor. They just conducted that, I think, back in April, and it's always hard to really make a long-term prediction, but at least through the early part of summer, predictions for this year anyway are in the normal range. But even if it's a quote-unquote normal year for wildfire, we still have a lot of wildfire. That's just kind of a given living in these western fire-adapted landscapes. But we'll see how the summer continues to shape up, and hope that we continue to get good precipitation.
Am I wrong? I feel like when we're talking about climate change, which is obviously super locked into forest health, but in the case of these forest fires, it's almost like the graph for a very, very long time was like there was a pretty easy through line through the graph, and it was somewhat predictable. Like maybe there'd be a dry year one year and then a wetter year. But if you think about the peaks and valleys, they were kind of in the same, within the same general area of the graph. Right. Yep. And then at some point over maybe the last 20 years, I don't know, the graph just started going up and down. And so we could have an insane year like 2020. And then last year, at least from my perspective, not paying very close attention, it wasn't crazy. 2022 was, but it's almost just like this violent shaking. And as a scientist, what do you think, what comes to your mind when you see the graph start shaking up and down like that?
The dynamic there, obviously, as you pointed out, is that we do have bad fire years related to things like drought and just the fuel that's available to burn on the landscape. High winds, of course, being a big contributor to the fires, the big extreme fires that we've seen. And so we do have, if we think of the sort of the bar graph or histogram in total, these years, these spikes, these years that are pretty bad. 2002 with the Hayman fire was a bad year. 2012 with the High Park fire. 2013, and Waldo Canyon that year, 2013 Black Forest fire, 2020, of course, being the big one with the fires we've already discussed. So these certainly these spikes that occur, but then also within that context, just seeing an overall upward trend in wildfire activity, as you mentioned, in the past 20 years in particular, since about 2000, so 20 plus years. So even with the spikes, just still seeing an overall increase if you kind of were to draw a line connecting these bars and this bar graph that we're visualizing. And one interesting thing that we're also seeing is not only an overall increase in wildfire activity, but an increase in large fires. So, 20 years ago, we would have considered a 10,000 acre fire a large fire, and now that's not so large. We're talking more in the 50 to 100,000 acre range when we see fires. And so certainly if you break down any of those bars individually by fire size, we do see a real increase in fires that are, say, more than 50,000 acres happening over the last couple of decades. So it's sort of this dynamic of overall increased wildfire activity, increases in severity, and increases in fire size and scale and area that we're seeing burned.
And so I always get a little bit sheepish when I'm talking to super smart scientists because I don't know anything. And so I'm going to ask very basic questions.
No, sure.
But Why is that the case? I mean, you sent me a lot of really, really great material that I was able to read, and I could actually understand. Some of your real scientific papers, my brain's not quite good enough, but I could read the abstract. But can you just walk us through, from your perspective or from the data and from the science, what are the major causes for this? Like, has the graph started going up and down?
Yeah, so really, we look to climate change and a lot of the drivers associated with climate change as one of the main causes. So it's really kind of the combination of a long history of fuel buildup on the landscape through things like fire suppression and past management of our landscapes, other land uses that have created opportunity for, especially in our dry forest types, like our ponderosa pine, for trees to regenerate pretty prolifically and have now a pretty dense forest condition, a lot of trees on the landscape, much more so than we would have expected to see, had we been sitting in this room here in Boulder 150 years ago. And so more that's just as it relates to fuel that's available to burn. And really what we think of as kind of a backlog, what we often refer to as a fire deficit that has accrued over the last century plus. And so these systems are sort of ripe for burning. And then when you combine that condition on the landscape with changes in climate related to warmer temperatures, drought, high winds. It is in a lot of ways, especially in our extreme years, a perfect storm of these things coming together, and that's what results often in the type of fire that we've been seeing and that we saw in 2020.
Have you ever read The Big Burn by Timothy Egan?
Yep.
So I'm obsessed with Theodore Roosevelt, but I'm not. I don't see him as a superhero, and I see all his flaws. And that's one of his biggest flaws, is his idea that he and Pinchot brought into the mainstream of trying to suppress the fires and win. Yeah, it's typical TR. Like, we're going to dominate. But do you, from your experience and your whole career, I mean, was that kind of the turning point when they decided, when the Forest Service came in and was like, all right, our new strategy is there aren't going to be any forest fires, and if they are, we're going to dominate them and knock them down. Was that when things started changing and the fuel really started building up, when you say 100 years ago?
Yeah, that's often the time period that we look to, early 1900s when we talk about fire suppression as a policy, and the 10 o'clock rule that was instituted.
Wait, tell me that again?
The 10 o'clock rule, which basically was a policy that any ignition, any smoke that's spotted on the landscape, the newly formed agency, the U.S. Forest Service at the time, they had a policy of trying to get that fire out, that smoke out by 10 o'clock the next morning. Wow. Essentially. Okay. And so just a real concerted effort to control fire, to put fire out. And we've been pretty successful at that, over the last 100 plus years now. But what we're seeing is just an inability in the face of climate change to control fire. And what we see under especially extreme weather conditions is, just an inability to suppress fire. And I'd say really a recognition over that time period as well of the natural role of fire. And that is a point that I really want to make here, is that we often talk, and I find myself doing this as well, about fire as this bad thing, this destructive force, and that's often how it manifests now, unfortunately. But it's important to recognize that all of our forested systems here in Colorado, really from our dry forest types here at lower elevation on up into our higher elevation, lodgepole, spruce fir, even evolved with fire in some form and are adapted to fire. And fire is a really important process for maintaining forest health, maintaining a lot of the important values and services that we rely on from the forest. But it's a matter of kind of being out of balance, in my mind, with natural fire, especially in our dry forest, and what we would have expected natural fire to do in terms of shaping the landscape historically. And so the type of fire that we do see now tends to be these big fires that make headlines and have, as it relates to outcomes, negative outcomes, related to community impacts, air quality, water resources, just the whole host of things that we're concerned about. So I always try to make sure that I'm thinking about fire kind of on those two terms, sort of the benefits related to fire and what we can do to minimize the negative outcomes related to fire.
Well, it makes perfect sense when you think about the numbers that you said. They used to be 10,000. A fire was 10,000 acres, and then when it just continues to be suppressed and suppressed and suppressed, it's almost like, well, the scales are going to balance one way or the other.
Exactly.
And so it's going to be hundreds of thousands of acres. Mm-hmm. One more question about causes. Sure. Talk to me about the pine beetle, because that's something, the area, the two big fires that we were just talking about up in Grand County, and that, anybody who's spent time through there, and for people who aren't familiar with Colorado, kind of north of Winter Park, the ski resort, place has been devastated by the pine beetle. Probably, I feel like in my travels around the state, that place always sticks out as one of the worst. I've heard conflicting ideas about the pine beetle and how much that affects an area's likelihood to catch on fire. So can you tell me about pine beetles? Yeah,
it's a great question. And as you mentioned just now, somewhat nuanced, complex dynamic there where, obviously when you see a lot of dead trees on the landscape, you think that's a tinderbox that's going to go up as soon as we have an ignition, just go up in flames. And, interestingly, a lot of the research doesn't necessarily show an increase in wildfire risk associated with beetle kill. There is a point at which in the sort of stages of beetle kill, what we call the red phase in particular, where the needles are still on the trees, where I think there is an uptick in risk. But once you enter what's called the gray phase and the needles fall off, the risk itself, because those systems, especially lodgepole, that's what they do. They burn at high severity, so they are a system that's adapted to high severity, what we often call stand replacing fire.
Okay.
And so the type of fire that we would expect to burn through those systems doesn't necessarily distinguish between a dead tree and a live tree. It's going to
that's what I'd read somewhere.
Take out a live tree just as soon as it will a dead tree. Mm-hmm.
I met a guy who was studying that actually at CU Boulder, and I was asking about it. He sent me a paper, and I think the term they used was bulk density, and that an alive tree with full needles has more bulk density than one that's been dead for 5 years. And so, as far as fuel goes, those fires are hot enough that they're going to burn everything. And so I thought that was so counterintuitive to me.
It's an interesting story because, just as you mentioned, you would think, obviously, with all of that dead and downed timber or wood on the landscape, fuel, you would have the conditions much more so for a big high severity fire. And I will say, as it relates to just the fuel that's present on the landscape, and in the case of a beetle-killed stand, a lot of dynamics there with how fires are approached from a tactical standpoint by incident management teams, where often in the case of beetle-killed stand of say, lodgepole, it's not safe to put firefighters in that condition.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
And so there are some dynamics also related to fire response and fire suppression that come into play that you probably wouldn't otherwise see with a non-beetle kill affected area. And so the beetle kill does have an influence on fire suppression tactics and just how we manage wildfires. But again, those systems themselves, lodgepole, that's what they're adapted to and how they have experienced fire over time. I'll say, one interesting, and there's a good bit of research going on this right now. Chuck Rhodes, a researcher with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, has been real engaged in this type of work, but looking at compound disturbances, so beetle-killed, that is then followed by wildfire, and sort of the two disturbances coming together, and what that means for the future of the forest, and how the forest may or may not regenerate naturally from those fire events. And so just some real interesting questions
what are
that are coming up
theories?
with that. So the most recent paper that I've looked at does suggest, especially following beetle kill and fire, more limited natural regeneration, but still some regeneration, but in a way where we, I think over the long term, would expect these geographies, especially in lodgepole, to not come back quite like they are currently structured in terms of high forest density and just large continuous patches of forest. Yeah, a lot to be sort of unraveled there still, and it is a pretty active body of research.
When you think about a mountainside of beetle-killed trees, which is, when I think about Grand County, that's a lot of times what I think of. Say no fire came through, what are the theories on how that's going to look 20 or 30 years from now? Because I've heard aspen trees are going to take over, and they seem to, grow faster and spread faster. I don't know. What are the ideas about just in general, even if you take fire out of it, what's going to replace these dead stands of beetle-killed trees?
Yeah, I think the aspen component that you mentioned is certainly one, and that is one species that we're often also seeing come back from these high-severity fire events just due to its vegetative reproductive mechanism, where it can come back from stems that have been top-killed by fire, but it maintains the capacity to reproduce from roots, essentially, so not seed dependent. And so we do see the species that have that adaptation, such as aspen, do pretty well in post-fire landscapes, and that's great. We love aspen from the standpoint of wildlife diversity, just having a deciduous broadleaf tree species in an otherwise conifer-dominated forest has benefit from the standpoint of future wildfire risk and community protection, less flammable than conifers often. So we have actually been actively engaged in promoting aspen, trying to, where we can, transition lodgepole stands toward aspen for those reasons. But in the case of more pure lodgepole, in terms of the beetle, it often would affect mature cone-bearing trees. So you might lose sort of that cohort or that generation of trees, but then you would expect to have the younger trees that were less affected by the beetle coming into a mature state, producing cones, and then eventually placing the stand as lodgepole. And so I think that in my mind would be, in the absence of fire, probably the trajectory we might expect, but with some increase in aspen, as you mentioned, as well. And that's, what's interesting to me, and a point I do want to get across here, is that there's so much nuance associated with forest type that we need to consider here. Whereas you mentioned in both the Cameron Peak and East Troublesome fires, burning at higher elevation in our lodgepole systems, and at those higher elevation systems, again, the type of fire we saw was not necessarily outside of what we think of as like a historic range of variability for those fire types. So they obviously have big impacts as it relates to the human toll and other ecosystem services that we care about, but just fire as a process, some consistency with what we would expect to see historically. I think probably some question of scale and just how widespread, how much area the fires burned, but in terms of the fire severity and behavior, not too unlike what we probably would have expected to see those stands burn at, a couple hundred years ago even. But the real distinction that I want to make here is with what we think of as our drier forest types, so our ponderosa pine and what we call dry mixed conifer in our lower elevation zones. So just looking out of our window here in Boulder and the foothills, mostly ponderosa pine that we're looking at, and these forests being adapted really to more frequent fire historically, so on the order of every 10, 15, maybe upwards of 30 years. And historically, that type of fire and that return interval would have served to kind of clear out the underbrush, maintain a real open forest condition, and a real spatial mosaic where we could think of meadows being sort of punctuated with groups of trees and single individual trees out there. So just a real diverse landscape structure spatially. So what we've seen over time is just a real infilling, increase in forest density in these ponderosa pine forest. And then when we do have fire now, it looks more like what I just described for lodgepole, where it's really stand replacing high severity fire.
Sure.
And the nuance that I want to really point out here is that ponderosa didn't evolve in a way that lodgepole did to recover from that type of fire. And so we're just seeing lack of recovery altogether in a lot of cases. And one really good example that's been studied really well and is the subject of a lot of really great research papers is the Hayman fire from 2002. And, now 20 plus years later, still areas that just aren't coming back as forest. And so that really presents us with a question of the future of the forest, and should we expect a forest to come back? Is it going to transition to shrubland or grassland? It presents some real interesting management questions. In some cases, at some scales, that may be fine. But in other cases where we socially see and ecologically see value to forest, it's a concern, in that we're losing a lot of our dry forest altogether and potentially transitioning to these other vegetation states. So it does raise some real interesting management questions from the standpoint of how we think about fire in the dry forest types and future forest trajectories socially and ecologically, what the values are, what we'd like to see there, and are there roles and interventions that we can take to help with forest recovery when and where appropriate.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about that. But one more question, just kind of setting the stage about the severity of these fires. And can you talk a bit about how these fires impact water? Because it's one of those things that it made perfect sense, but I just never really thought about it. And that's where TNC does such a great job with the storytelling, so that people like me can understand. But I've talked about water on this podcast a lot. We had Taylor Hawes on who's doing great work on the Colorado. How do you think about fire as it relates to we human in cities' need for water?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. It's really anchored our forest program in a lot of ways over the years, this connection between forest and water, and the impacts that we've seen from wildfire to water resources specifically. So the example that I always point to is the 1996 Buffalo Creek fire in the Upper South Platte watershed southwest of Denver, which was a wind-driven fire event, really right between the North Fork and I think main stem of the South Platte River going into Strontia Springs Reservoir, essentially, which of course is an important reservoir for Denver water as a utility. And the post-fire, as it relates to, so it was high severity, lost all the vegetative cover, and post-fire impacts as it related to rain in particular after the fire, and what we saw from a soil erosion, sedimentation standpoint into Strontia Springs Reservoir, and then 2002 Hayman fire, similar impacts to Cheeseman Reservoir, and those in total, in terms of cost to Denver Water, upwards of $30 million in recovery and dredging the reservoirs of the sediment from the wildfires. And so just this connection between forest, high severity fire, really removing vegetation that would otherwise hold our soils in place in our steep slopes and topography, and a lot of that soil just washing right into our waterways, our creeks, our streams, on into our rivers, into our reservoirs. And so that's really something since those early fires that we've seen time and again with the fires that we're facing. And 2020 in particular, a lot of impact that we've seen, especially in where I live in Fort Collins, to the Cache-la-Poudre and Big Thompson watersheds. But just that connection between forest and water water resource impacts from wildfire is really when we think about values overall, one of the main things that we consider. And it really, in terms of our prioritization of our work and where we do our work, it again anchors a lot of the work, because we know we need to be protecting our water resources. Like you just mentioned, water is such a precious commodity here, or resource, I should say, here in the Western U.S. in particular, and we need to do everything we can to protect it.
Yeah, that link is very powerful if you think about somebody living in, say, downtown Denver, who may not, ever really have any interest in doing anything outdoors. Or the bottom line is, in order for Denver or Colorado Springs or Fort Collins or Pueblo to exist, a lot of water is needed.
Absolutely.
And that's a very direct link to every single human living in Colorado.
That's right. Yeah.
And why wildfire is important for them. That's what I often think about a lot of this conservation work, particularly in the West, is that, when people hear conservation, people who may not be familiar, they think, oh, well, it's making the world better and everybody can feel good and all this thing. And sometimes I think about it, it's very selfish for us humans. Like, we have to do it, because if we don't do it, like in the case of these, if we don't figure out how to deal with these fires and figure out how to protect our water supply, nobody's going to be able to live here anymore. That's or at least it's going to be a lot less people.
Yep.
And then the whole economic impacts of that. And so, I don't know. I wish people could switch in their mind. The average citizen could switch from thinking conservation is a luxury to realizing that it's mandatory to be able to live in an arid environment like this, in a fragile environment.
Absolutely. And just on that point, I really appreciate you raising it. And to me, it's where I start, really, in thinking about forest is around the values, what we care about. So, if there weren't values within our forested system, would we care if it burns up at 100,000 acres per day type of rate like we saw with East Troublesome? And so for me, it does get to this question of values for both people and nature. And we think about biodiversity, about wildlife habitats, about water quality, about air quality, about carbon sequestration and storage, about opportunities for recreation. So kind of this combination of both people and nature-based values. But I think you're absolutely right that it's not a luxury. It's really more looking to protect the values and resources and services that we rely on into the future under climate change.
$30 million out of the Denver water checking account. That's not an insignificant amount of money.
No.
I mean, you think if that's continued, even if that just happened every few years, but if it's going up at an exponential rate, just if you care about nothing more than money, that doesn't work.
No. And I mean, to that point, and that's a figure just for the water-related recovery. And so when we think about what wildfire is costing us in total, when we think about other impacts, the cost associated with just fire suppression itself, I think the figure I read most recently from the U.S. Forest Service in terms of just agency-wide across the country, it's upwards of $1.9 billion a year that is spent by the agency on fire suppression and other recovery-related aspects to fire. And so when we think about this cycle that we're in, where we're largely in sort of a reactive state and spending a lot of money to be reactive, could we shift some of that more towards proactive and being in a proactive state and really doing what we can to try to head off some of these impacts and avoid them altogether to begin with?
Well, that's the perfect segue, because that's what I was getting ready to ask you. Yeah. So how do we fix it? What do we do? It seems like there's two buckets when I think about it in my simple terms. There's the trying to prevent, trying to manage so that things operate more within the normal cycle so that these fires, if they do start, they're not as bad. And then there is all right, the fire came through. Mm-hmm. We need to figure out a way to help the land recover. So on the first bucket of trying to be more of a proactive to prevent these things, what are you excited about? What's the Nature Conservancy excited about? What kind of stuff are you working on that gives you hope?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And I'll start actually just where you left off with that integration between what we think of as pre-fire and post-fire, and that really centering a lot of the work that we're doing here. But in the pre-fire, sort of before wildfire phase, it is focused a good bit on identifying the areas that are most at risk of high severity wildfire and prioritizing resources for forest management in those areas. And so forest management including things like thinning, including prescribed fire, and doing that at a scale that is meaningful and may actually have a meaningful impact on wildfire. And so we work a lot with various collaborative groups. We help convene and then help kind of steer and work hand in hand with these various watershed-based, what we're referring to now as fireshed-based collaborative groups that involve agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, the State Forest Service, other nonprofit groups, utilities, local watershed coalitions, local open space programs, kind of a whole host of actors in this area to really come up with these landscape visions, desired conditions, and plans for forest management to reduce the risk that's out there and have the effect that we hope to have on wildfire through forest management.
It seems to me that the science is complicated, but thanks to people like you, we can figure out the science. But to me, looking at it from the outside in, the kind of X factor seems to be all the number of people involved. Because you're dealing maybe sometimes with private landowners, a lot of time with public land. You're dealing with all these different agencies, involved. And so if one thing has become very clear from all these conversations I've had with Nature Conservancy people is that partnerships are everything. And that, whether you're talking about partnership with the individual landowner to partnerships with the National Forest Service, that is one of the key things that TNC is so good at doing, is facilitating these productive partnerships. So do you ever get, to me, it just seems overwhelming dealing with all those different groups, and that everybody has the best of intentions, but they may have different ideas about how to go forward. So how do you handle that? How do you even start to handle that? Yeah,
it's a great question. And to the point about what gives me hope, one of the things that does give me hope is just seeing the collaboration and the way in which the different agencies and organizations have come together around this shared priority. And it's not to say everything within a collaborative context always goes 100% smoothly, but we do find that we gather around this common interest, this common priority, and we can develop these at a landscape scale approaches to how we do our plans, how we do forest management on the ground, how we monitor the work that we're doing, how we learn from it through the science. And so that, in my mind, again, is one area that over the last, I would say 10 plus years in particular, this collaborative forest management aspect, just an area that gives me a lot of hope, and it's so far in my mind it's being effective. We're not where we need to be by any means in terms of the pace and scale of forest management, but I do feel like we're getting there and have hope that we'll continue to get there. And I'm certainly encouraged. One of the things that gives me hope just in the last year or so is all the federal resources going into the issue through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through the Inflation Reduction Act, and just the influx and increase in funding that we're seeing go to the issue, and the U.S. Forest Service's wildfire crisis strategy, kind of providing the frame for a lot of that work on National Forest System lands in particular, but extending to other geographies, other land ownerships as well. And so it does feel like we're at a point where we've identified, recognized the issues that we're facing, and we are coming up with solutions, ways of at scale really addressing the challenges and tackling the challenges. Ways to go still, but again,
always is. There always is
by what we've seen. Yep.
Can you give me an example of a specific project that you could describe that you've been happy with? I mean, whether it's pre or post fire, just something that you've been involved in that was effective in the moment, and then also could serve as a good model going forward in other, throughout anywhere in the West, really, where this fire issue is such a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just as it relates to the collaborative aspect, we have been involved in a number of collaborative forest management projects on the Front Range, from down near where you are in Colorado Springs area on the Southern Front Range, an initiative known as the Upper Monument Creek Landscape Restoration Initiative, on up through the Central Front Range, Upper South Platte watershed, and then here on the Northern Front Range, a collaborative known as the Northern Colorado Fireshed. And really, I guess a common theme throughout those, and maybe I'll point to the Upper South Platte specifically, but a common theme is what you mentioned around just a diverse landscape as it relates to ownership patterns, the wild and urban interface mix, the communities that are present. In the case of the Upper South Platte geography, I think about the National Forest System lands with the Pike National Forest, state lands through things like state parks, Staunton State Park in particular, Jefferson County open space, so at the local level, open space lands, Denver Mountain Parks, and then, of course, all the private lands around Conifer, Bailey, those areas, and really coming up with these approaches that develop collaboratively based cross-boundary plans for the work on the ground, and then working together to find funding, other resources to actually make the work on the ground happen. And collaboratively designing and implementing projects, monitoring those projects, learning from them, and doing what we need to do to get to scale. And so that partnership in particular, and I think the same things apply to the other ones that I mentioned, but just seeing some really good momentum, good energy among all the partners to really tackle the problem at hand and really scale up the work and get to the scale that we need to be.
This may be a dumb question, but is there a kind of for-profit money-making incentive for any business to go in and thin these forests out? Because that just seems like a huge amount of work and very expensive. But like everything, if there's a way to make some money doing it, it becomes a lot easier. Is there anything like that you've seen, whether it's even, it doesn't even have to be with fires, but even like clearing out beetle kill? Has anybody figured out a way to do that and make money?
That's a great question. It's a hard question.
Yeah.
It's one of our real major barriers, I would say, is what we often refer to as just utilization of the biomass or of the wood product coming from these projects, where we obviously don't have much of a wood-based market, much of an industry here in Colorado, especially on the Front Range, a little more so in the southwestern part of the state. But one of the key challenges that we face is just there's not a real good outlet, a good use for the materials. In some cases, we end up building piles and burning piles as a way of just reducing fuels and getting rid of the small diameter material in particular. So it is something that, as long as I've been involved in this work for over a decade now, that we've been grappling with. And there are some promising uses as it relates to things like biochar, energy production through things like wood pellets, just wood chips and landscaping materials, other forest products, more sort of like saw timber based products. More we're seeing as it relates to the role of technology, potential for what's known as mass timber or cross-laminated timber. So things that are coming up as it relates to wood utilization, but right now it's just not at the scale that it really needs to be sort of self-sustaining and viable. It's what I would characterize more as sort of niche market uses for material. But I do think there's, just to your question about opportunity, I do think there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a real concerted effort to try to build and sort of broadcast that opportunity in some ways so that we attract investment and attract businesses that are forest products based, and really try to build workforce and economic and job opportunities, around the work that's going on the ground. And again, some really great smaller scale examples of good utilization of materials from these projects, but we're, again, just not where we need to be with that.
I was just wondering if I'd missed something, because it seems like I know there's an opportunity in there. It's just somebody's got to figure it out.
Right.
Another question I had, or more of something I'd love for you to tell the listeners about, in some of the material I was reading, preparing, there was some really interesting parts about beavers and beaver dams and how those are so great for forest and actually very good for pre-wildfire prevention. Can you talk about beavers and their role in all of this?
Yeah, that's an area that I'm really excited about, as I myself am learning more about it. So I've traditionally focused more in what we often refer to as the upland forest environment, a little less so in our riparian sort of wetland or stream or river corridors. And that's been a narrow focus. I'm certainly expanding my view and being a little more holistic at a broader watershed scale, and thinking about those areas that just hold moisture more so within the landscape, and especially as it relates to fire. And what I think kind of led to my eye-opening there was just in the wake of fires like Cameron Peak, East Troublesome, and some work that researchers like Emily Fairfax and others have been doing, showing that, from, say, an aerial photo, in some cases the only areas of green vegetation left are in those riparian corridors. And when we think about that as not only a potential fire break, but also an area for fire recovery, so refugia, area where you might have a surviving ponderosa pine tree that could be cone bearing and provide seed for forest recovery and forest regeneration. It's again opened my eyes to the importance of those systems in particular in a wildfire context specifically. And so this link that we're trying to make here within TNC between our forest and water team, and then a lot of our partners are focused on it as well, between the forest and these riparian settings, doing what we can to promote what are known as low-tech, process-based restoration approaches, beaver dam analogs, those types of things, or reintroduction of beaver altogether. But just thinking, again, about those areas as really important from the standpoint of wildfire dynamics, the way in which wildfire moves across a landscape, and what's left and what's green after a wildfire. So again, this integration between kind of the upland setting that I've been focused on most of my career and the riparian area is an area that I'm really excited to move our program into more so.
There's some book by a guy named I think it's Ben Goldfarb, and it's called Eager, and it's it's just one of these books that's just about beavers. And I love books like that. Like there's one by the guy who wrote that book, Salt, but it's just about the fish cod. And I've yet to read the Eager book, but I've heard great things about it. And after preparing for this, it made me want to read it. It's funny thinking about beaver, because when you think about the first European push into the West, it was to get beaver hides.
Exactly. Right.
And they cleaned them out.
Yep.
And then it's just been one boom and bust for century and a half now. And that was the first. And now it turns out that the first thing we came through here and wiped out could be one of the solutions to fixing our problems.
Absolutely. And just when we think about species like the beaver that are engineers essentially, and how they can shape and influence their environments, I think beaver is just a great example of that. And obviously, as you mentioned, with a lot of historical context and even present day sensitivities around beaver and their influence on the environment. But in my mind, as it relates to the importance of some of these natural processes, it's important to be thinking about how we can balance the benefits provided by a species like the beaver.
Do you like history? Do you pay attention?
I do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What do you like to read? Like any particular time period or?
Well, I read a lot of natural history, and just the comment on beaver that you just mentioned. I recently read the book Astoria.
Oh, I love that.
So
I had
maybe
him on
not
the
so
podcast.
Much. Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
right.
Peter Stark,
Yep.
and he's
Mhm.
got a new book coming out later this summer, so he's going to come back on.
Yeah,
He's a cool
yeah,
guy.
Yeah.
How great is
So
that book,
I
Astoria?
love the book. And so interestingly, I had mentioned earlier, our my wife and I, our older son, Will, is going off to Oregon State in the fall for college, and we were visiting. We went to Powell's bookstore because you've got to do that when you're in Portland, and had not heard of Astoria. I knew Peter Stark, of course, but I just came across it there in Powell's, and I always like to, when I'm visiting a place, try to learn through visiting a local bookstore a little bit about the history of the place, and so picked up a copy of Astoria, and just so riveting. Yeah, and so it was, just as it relates to your point about beaver, the history of the kind of beaver trapping and trade, just really, really fascinating. And so that's the type of, I would say, the type of reading that
we're the same
like to do. So yeah,
that book, I remember I picked it up just at the Boulder bookstore actually, and I was attracted or drawn in by the cover because it's just a really cool looking cover. Mm-hmm. But I read that thing in a day and a half.
Yeah, well,
and I think that must be where I learned about the whole initial push to get the beaver out, because he presents all this really detailed history in a way that's so fun to read, and you finish and you're like, oh, now I know a lot about
exactly,
that stuff. One more question about fires post-fire. So thinking of these areas where fires come through so hot, taking out everything, no seeds left, nothing. What are the approaches, some of the hopeful approaches for dealing with a place that has just been wiped clean?
Right.
What do you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this actually is another area that I'm really excited about that does kind of get back to what we were talking about earlier about the integration of kind of pre and post-fire work, where in the post-fire landscape, I think as it relates specifically to climate adaptation and thinking about approaches to management that are in line with what we were expecting as it relates to future climate and future forest, essentially. And so some really interesting tools that have been developed that we've had a role in. Catherine Schlegel on our team leads a lot of this work, but in cooperation with the Rocky Mountain Research Station of the Forest Service, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, Ecological Restoration Institute at Northern Arizona University, developing these spatial models, essentially spatial tools to help us identify those areas of the landscape that may be best suited for future forest based on things like landform and where we would expect to have conditions as it relates to moisture and other factors that would support future forest. And really, if we're going to engage in actual reforestation and planting seedlings or dispersing seed, doing it in a way that is aimed at really promoting the survival and growth of the seedlings that are planted or the seeds that are put out. So we don't want to grow a bunch of seedlings in the nursery, go plant them, and then have them all die, right?
Sure.
And so identifying those areas that the seedlings are likely to be most successful, and then even thinking about as it relates to, again, these social and ecological values, are there areas that maybe in the future they're going to just be better suited as grassland or shrubland, and accepting that. And that gets to one of the key climate adaptation decision-making frameworks that we work under, known as RAD, Resist, Accept, Direct. Great acronym. Love that one. But basically thinking through for a given area, there may be areas that you don't want to see really change from climate and other factors. And so we do what we can to try to resist those effects and keep what's there. Those areas that we may just need to accept there's going to be some transition and be okay with that and see the value in the transition. And then some areas that we may actually take an active role in transforming and having interventions to help create a condition that's going to be more resilient and adapted to future climate. And so kind of thinking across that spectrum and using that to guide the management activities on the ground is one area that we focus. And so another example related to the post-fire recovery context is thinking about ponderosa pine, again, as this typically lower elevation, dry forest type. Are we expecting to see it move upslope more so as a species in terms of its range under future climate? And if so, in what areas? And is there a role for us in our reforestation and recovery efforts to help facilitate that by planting at slightly higher elevations, for example?
That's cool.
And so just, thinking about all those factors in the post-fire context and what we envision, as a future forest, what we think is going to be resilient, what we think is going to sustain a lot of the values and services that we care about, and structuring our management accordingly.
Last question for you. This is so interesting, and I've learned so much. And again, as I was saying when we first met, it's a very selfish project because I just want to know all this stuff. And I also want to know, what are some good books that people could, or books, resources, blogs? I'll link to the one, Emily, I believe is her name, about the beavers.
Emily Fairfax.
Yeah, that was great. I loved that. I'll link to that. But any resources that you would point people to that are interested in this but may not have a science background, but they hear this, I want to learn more.
Yeah, so in terms of just my own reading and some of what I would consider to be sort of the formative books, we touched actually on one earlier, The Big Burn, Timothy Egan, really shaped just how I think about the history of fire in the western U.S. and the founding of the U.S. Forest Service and development over time of policy related to fire. So certainly recommended that one. Young Men in Fire is one that definitely stands out for me, Norman MacLean. And as I was myself getting into fire and being trained in fire on prescribed fire crews and whatnot, that book for me, just learning about the Mann Gulch tragedy and the way in which Norman MacLean really dives into some of the science around fire behavior and thinking about the development over time of fire behavior modeling and understanding the factors that influence fire, fuel, weather, topography being kind of the big three.
Yep.
It was just really brought together in a real compelling,
such a good book,
and informative way. So love that one. We just as an organization are doing a lot more in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, and as it relates specifically to our forest and fire work, trying to think about how we can broaden our partnerships that I touched on earlier to involve groups, folks who have been underrepresented, not had a seat at the table, and trying to do what we can to broaden the table much more so. And I would say specifically as it relates to tribal engagement and opportunity as it relates to fire, to work with tribes as another area that we're working to advance and thinking about it as kind of a co-creation with tribal partners.
Yes.
Just given especially their long history in fire and what we often think of as the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, and just ways in which in a prescribed fire context, things like cultural burning can be incorporated.
Nice.
So I have been on a little bit of a personal learning journey just around indigenous uses of fire, and then just as it relates, I guess specifically, just back to your question about books, around just better understanding of indigenous history and culture here in Colorado and on the Front Range. I recently finished reading Chief Left Hand by Margaret Cole, who I believe lives here in Boulder.
I think so. I know the book. I've not read it.
Cole, Coel, and just a really great compilation as it relates to just the historical context and interactions, with Governor Evans, Colonel Shivington, Chief Left Hand, just all the dynamics at that time, middle part of the 1800s, culminating in the Sand Creek Massacre, and that part obviously being a really hard part to read and know, what happened there, but obviously really important to understand all the context there. And so that's certainly one I would recommend that I, again, just finished reading recently as well.
That's great. Well, I have links to those. That's all really great stuff. And I've read the first two, but I have not read that one. I read Young Men and Fire in high school, and I still clearly remember it.
Yep.
And that was kind of an embarrassing long time ago. Well, I just really enjoyed this. The time flew by. So much to learn, and y'all are doing such a great job with all this, and I'm just really appreciate you taking the time out of all the important stuff you're doing to let me ask you questions. But keep up the great work. This is really exciting stuff.
Well, thank you, Ed, and again, really appreciate being on the program, and thank you for everything you're doing here.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.